morning, good afternoon, good evening. On behalf of the Gender and Trade Coalition and the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on trade, gender, and post-war recovery, visioning feminist trade alternatives for sustainable peace. My name is Carol Cohn. I'm the director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights. In the last few months, it's been our great pleasure and privilege to collaborate with the Gender and Trade Coalition in organizing this two-part webinar series, which explores the relationships between gender, trade, and the prospects for sustainable peace. For the consortium, this set of relationships is an important part of our Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Planet project. The Feminist Roadmap project is based on the premise that building peace is politically and environmentally sustainable requires addressing the inequalities, marginalizations, and exclusions that underlie armed conflicts. And it focuses on the transnational political economic actors and dynamics, and also closely related to those, the transnational climate disruption and environmental degradation processes that tend to deepen inequalities in countries emerging from war instead of transforming them. Our goal is both to analyze and to transform those processes through developing innovative feminist solutions. In our work on this project, we've come to see the international trade architectures and practices as a major force in shaping and often undermining the prospects for sustainable peace. Yet its impacts and import are too often unexamined or overlooked by communities that work on peace building or on the women, peace, and security agenda, or on that period that is called post-war recovery, even though, as many feminists have rightly pointed out, the idea of post-war itself is problematic. In developing our understandings of the ways that trade can affect nearly everything about people's day-to-day lives and livelihoods in countries struggling to emerge from armed conflict, we've learned a tremendous amount from the members of the Gender and Trade Coalition. So it's really been a gift to be able to now collaborate with the GTC in organizing these webinars. So now I'd like to turn to Aishu Balaji, Senior Coordinator at Regions Refocus, to tell you more about the Gender and Trade Coalition and this webinar series. Aishu?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carol. The Gender and Trade Coalition is really happy to collaborate with the consortium on this two-part webinar series and introduce our work to a new audience. I wanted to say a couple of words about the coalition before handing over to our wonderful chair for today, Nancy Kachingwe. The Gender and Trade Coalition was created in 2018 in response to the increasing co-optation of women's rights by institutions like the World Trade Organization to further the liberalization of capital, resources, and labor. After feminist groups and other social movements organized for decades to challenge the neoliberal trade regime and unpack its gendered impacts, some international organizations began recognizing its unique consequences for women. But instead of any kind of deep engagement, they began to instrumentalize a very shallow conception of women's rights as a tool to actually deepen and expand this unjust trade system. So in this context, it became really critical for feminist actors to come together and push back on this co-optation and articulate a collective feminist agenda on trade justice. The GTC is effectively creating the infrastructure for this kind of shared work. So it brings together over 300 civil society organizations, like women's groups and trade unions and more from around the world, led by an elected steering group. And it's generating analysis and shaping advocacy in spaces like the WTO, UNCTAD, the CSW, and more. This collaboration with the consortium offered a really exciting opportunity to extend our analysis around trade justice to consider how it intersects with post-war recovery, where part one really challenged this notion of post-war and the tendency to put trade liberalization forward as an instrument for post-war recovery and development. Part two today will unpack alternative feminist visions for sustainable peace. Thank you so much for your time, and very happy to hand over to our chair, Nancy Kachingwe, who joins us from the incredible South Feminist Futures.
Thank you, Aishu and Carol. It's an honor to be here. I listened very enthusiastically last week at the first webinar. And it's quite fascinating to have this topic. I'm based in Harare. I'm a coordinator of South Feminist Futures. I used to do a lot of work in trade, so I'm glad to be back in the space, but to be looking at it through a different lens. So welcome to all the participants who are here. Please let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat. It's always great to see all the places and spaces that we're all coming from, since we can't independently view. So I would like to just quickly on the housekeeping. The Q&A function is there for questions. If you could use the Q&A rather than the chat for your questions, but you know, we'll be monitoring both. There's closed caption as well. So if you need to actually see as well as listen, that is always a great support. So please do use it. And then in terms of there's a note in the chat: if you're experiencing any technical difficulties with Zoom during this panel, please email info@genderandsecurity.org. Maybe you can repost that. And at the end of the webinar, when you leave, there is a feedback form. It was very helpful at the last webinar, so we're asking you to please take the time to give some feedback. So just in terms of how we're going to use our time in this 90 minutes, I will introduce our two panelists, Nandini and Diyana, sorry, and then I will take a little bit of time to remind us a little bit about some of the points that were covered last week in the webinar. So if you'll excuse me, though, I'm the chair for taking a bit of time. Nandini and Diyana will then present for about 15 minutes each, and we will roll into questions and answers, which I'm sure there'll be very interesting and exciting ones coming from everyone in the audience. And if we have questions and answers to each other, Nandini and Diyana, please feel free to argue with each other if you don't agree with what the others are saying. So the space and the floor to agree and disagree is all ours. So let me start by introductions. Nandini Chami is Deputy Director and Fellow at IT for Change, based in Bengaluru, India. She is engaged in policy research and advocacy at the intersections of digital policy, development justice, and gender equality. Her research interests are data justice, inclusive platform economies, and gender and digital trade. She is part of advocacy efforts around the 2030 Development Agenda on issues of data for development and digital technologies and gender justice. She provides strategic support to IT for Change's Field Center, Prakia. And this work includes training programs for women's rights groups on adopting digital tools in their field practice and critical education for empowerment for rural adolescent girls. She has a master's in urban and rural community development from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. And her presentation, you guessed it, will be on feminist digital justice, visions for a trade and international order that brings sustainable peace. This discussion is about post-war and trade and gender, and bringing this digital justice aspect is really going to be an exciting set of ideas for us all to learn from. Diyana Yahaya, go to our second panelist, is an independent feminist activist, researcher, facilitator, and a member of the Gender and Trade Coalition based in Malaysia. Her work centers on trade and economic justice through a feminist lens, and through incorporating feminist participatory pedagogy and action research methodologies. She is part of the Feminist COVID-19 Response Collective and authored Another World is Possible, a feminist monitoring and advocacy toolkit for our feminist future. She also recently concluded the design and delivery of training on gender equality and macroeconomics for ERA Asia Pacific. Diyana's other recent publications include A Feminist Agenda for People and Planet, Principles and Recommendations for Feminist Economic Justice Agenda, and the Action Nexus for Generation Equality, and Creating a Feminist Alliance for Trade Justice in Open Democracy. Previously, she was a program officer at the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, APWLD, researching, building capacities and engaging in trade policy making on gender impacts of trade policy and promoting feminist alternatives to current trade agreements. And again, her presentation title fits exactly with her bio. Her presentation will be on feminist visions for alternatives to trade for peace, people, and the planet. So I just wanted to take us back to last week's webinar. We had Lebohang Peko, Fatima Kelleher, and Azra. Sorry, I don't have Azra's surname in front of me. I just call everyone by their first names. And they gave us three very, very interesting presentations around questions of not only unpacking questions of war, peace, security, and what that really means in the current sort of very neoliberal, neo-colonial context that we find ourselves, but also dug into a couple of case studies from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Nigeria on post-conflict situations, so-called post-conflict or post-war situations, and the ways in which trade, the current sort of neoliberal free trade, corporate-driven agenda is being used in post and conflict situations in order to drive further drive corporate interests and corporate power, both over resources, over markets, and even over sort of institutions and regulations that govern trade. And in the meantime, we see trade is being pushed, as Carol mentioned earlier, is being seen normally as it should be a tool for, in the post-war context, trade should be a tool for economic recovery, for creating employment, for diversifying. But currently, this question of the types of trade we are seeing, or trade regimes, so it's not just trade as in the exchange of goods and services, but the rules governing those goods and services is something that we have to question very carefully and ask ourselves whether these trade regimes are not, in fact, contributing to further conflict. Lebohang last week, as I said, we really unpacked the questions of war and peace, looking particularly at the state and its inherent misogyny and masculinization, and how in that process the state is the state these days, rather than adopting a posturing of development, is more and more often looking at all types of social economic challenges from a war posturing. So war on terror, war on poverty, war on COVID, it's war on everything. So that already always puts us in a permanently sort of militarized framing of how we deal with our problems. And she gave us experiences from South Africa, which is also, could be considered a post-conflict situation, and said we are living in this uncomfortable peace. Our past is still with us, and we're living in a siege mentality. And this uncomfortable peace is being demonstrated by all kinds of different social ills and violence. And therefore, looking at questions of structural violence, of the neoliberal ideology which targets women, and trade being a tool in this context of economic domination in the same way as war and violence are tools of physical domination. Fatima and Azra gave us two very good case studies from Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan on how trade and the idea of rebuilding markets or market recovery in post-conflict situations is being used by particularly by corporates. So we want economic recovery, and the idea is put forward as let's rebuild markets or bring in market recovery. But these are targeting food systems, indigenous food systems, and therefore targeting women to introduce new regimes of corporate control and by large agri and food corporations, amongst others. So these case studies showed us very clearly the ways in which this post-war so-called humanitarian machinery is operating to further corporate interests in these localities. On the question of on these two questions, the case studies really showed us conflict situations become ideal ground for pushing these corporate agendas because there are high levels of hunger and malnutrition. Humanitarian aid also plays a role in facilitating this. Fatima was pointing to market systems programs in Nigeria, and Azra was pointing to the food fortification programs in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but in Central Asia generally. And these are being seen by these so-called, in fact, in one case, it was the philanthrocapitalist Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which is a corporate lobbying for market-based strategies for alleviating hunger and nutrition. This is what they call it, forgetting that we should really be looking at human rights-based strategies for alleviating hunger and malnutrition. So it's already quite a nonsense in the way that it's being put. But they were targeting the wheat, flour, and milk production markets, where women play central roles in both production and of course, and consumption of these, and these are integral to livelihoods as well as these are integral to livelihoods and incomes, as well as, of course, food and survival. So just to wind up these mechanics of using trade, aid, debt to push through sort of these corporate agendas and restructure markets, impose new regulations around production, this sort of green revolution idea coming to the fore in really penetrating food systems in the most rural localities. And it's interesting to have those two case studies and looking at how food is being targeted, particularly as we are facing a climate crisis and facing even higher levels of food insecurity, and where questions of food sovereignty and local production of food are going to be ever more important and critical. They did come up, it was quite dire scenarios, but we did get some alternatives coming from last week, which we can use to start our discussion today. And I will just put down six of these. These are firstly, these are forces of imperialism that we're fighting, particularly from the US and Europe. And when can we talk? How can we talk of peace right now when we actually have to fight back? Land and land redistribution are very clear key questions of rolling back some of these situations, because food production, food sovereignty requires land, but land itself is one of the primary spaces of contestation in these in this new sort of, not new, this trade regime, because land is being used not for all kinds of land grabs are being used to produce all kinds of foods, like land is being given away for potatoes, to grow potatoes for potato crisps, or ethanol for biofuels. So those are quite but land has to be central to our struggle and our thinking around alternatives, as food sovereignty and local food production and ownership of the means of production, primarily land. The question of the instrumentalization of women parading behind a facade of defending women's human rights from patriarchy, but we have to ask ourselves, patriarchy is certainly bad and must be fought and dismantled, but imperialism is definitely much worse in terms of how it's operating through trade regimes in our context. And finally, community solidarity at local levels, and global solidarity at our transnational levels. As always, there is no way of building futures without solidarities at all those levels. So I hope I have been able to do some justice, excuse me for going on, in terms of framing what we talked about last week. And if I have misrepresented anything in the panelists from last week are here, I'm sure they will correct what anything that I have tried to summarize. So now for the main part, since you've had me for the first 15 minutes going on and on, I am really, really pleased and looking forward to hearing about digital justice and alternatives from Nandini. Please take the floor. You're welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Melissa, could I request you to pull up my slides? Thanks again. So let's begin with the wonderful summary that Nancy gave of part one of the webinar, and I'm sure many of you were also in the discussions last week. So it's very evident that an international trade and economic order that brings sustainable peace can only be something that is decolonized. This came across very strongly in all the discussions last week. And in my presentation, I would actually do this in a twofold way, where I will discuss why the current digital economic order is neocolonial, and then also try to think through, along with you, some of the ways by which we could challenge this and decolonize it. And I would like to hear your views and feedback on these proposals, and also hear from Diyana and others on, like, how we need to join hands and work together and all these things. Can I have the next slide, please? So first, when we think about war, right? Like when I was just thinking about the digital economy and war in a very surface level way, one thing that's very clear is that big tech companies have today become quasi-state actors in the international order, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has actually revealed this to us in a very chilling way. So if you recall, a few months ago in Feb 2022, when the conflict had just begun, when the invasion had just begun, many of you might recall that Ukrainian leaders were appealing to Apple, Meta, and Google to restrict their services inside Russia. And we also heard about Google's chief executive having meetings with EU officials on countering Russian disinformation. There were even news reports of these big tech companies sitting in on military intelligence briefings. And we also saw how Apple Pay and Google Pay suspending services in Russia led daily life for citizens to come to a standstill. And we saw this enormous infrastructural power of digital platforms. So going back to Thomas Hobbes' very famous theory of the Leviathan, typically we think of Leviathans as states and their excesses, right? But today, big tech companies have become quasi-states, and even states are appealing to these actors to enforce sanctions. So what does it tell us about their infrastructural power and enormous hold over our everyday life? Next slide. Here, I also want to step back and make an observation about when we think about digital tech that is used in the project of the state militarization and securitization, which was a very important theme that came up in the last webinar. Typically, the conversation tends to go in the route of talking about, having this moment of moral panic about Chinese surveillance tech, especially China's digital Silk Road projects and projects like the Smart Burkina project that was launched in 2021, along with smart city projects in many places in the world, about how Chinese companies will work with states in the south in order to help the states surveil their citizens in ways that violate human rights in the guise of conflict management and towards the agenda of militarization and securitization. I also just wanted to point out here that in this script about moral panic about China taking over the world, what we often tend to forget is that the digital neocolonialism has other poles as well. Of course, US tech firms do surveillance tech as big business, as Clearview AI, facial recognition software, and Primer AI natural language processing to detect military intelligence in the Ukraine war. These are US private companies. One of them is backed by Peter Thiel of Palantir fame. We can see that the US companies also act in very similar ways, and Europe, though it proudly proclaims itself as the holder of a third way, a human rights centered approach to data and AI, European firms are also not above board. We should remember that European nations are part of the Wassenaar arrangement on export control of arms and dual-use technologies, but they have not exercised these powers. Where you might recall that a few years ago, around 2015, the Ethiopian government was using European company digital surveillance tech to spy on its own populations in the guise of fighting local unrest and terrorism. So surveillance tech is big business today, and this surveillance tech and the project of increasing militarization of the state go hand in hand. And next slide. We actually see that we are living in a world today where there are two poles in the entire global, digital or AI economy or data economy, like however you like to term it, because that one is the United States and the other is China, as most of us recognize. So if you look at these statistics of where the top market capitalization of lead platform companies are located, or where you see the funding, the finance driving digital economy coming from, or the top level segments of AI research happening, these two countries practically dominate everything. Next slide. So, the case I would like to submit here is that when we look at this current bipolar digital economic order that perpetuates a neocolonialism, it also leads to this perpetual economic feuds, and hence it is anti-feminist. So here I would like to recall the words from this book published by the Southern Feminist Network, Dawn, about 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, the network observed that a development process that shrinks and poisons the pie available to poor people and then leaves women scrambling for a large relative share is not in women's interest. Essentially, to put it differently, economic injustice and gender injustice are two sides of the same coin. So we see that the digital economy is perpetuating and reinforcing all the ills of neoliberalism. So just to explain that a little bit more, in the platform economy, you see that there are gendered labor hierarchies and undermining of women's labor futures. And in the automation and digital transformation of value chains in agriculture, manufacturing, and services, women workers stand to lose the most. We also see that in the new gigs of the platform economy, which kind of destroys jobs with dedicated social security cover and reduces everyone to a perpetual hustler, we see that there is a simultaneous devaluation and valorization of women's care work for digital capital. And most egregiously, women's bodies, like in the menstrual apps, and women's life worlds, like in all these new projects that World Economic Forum has initiated about digitalizing the genes and genomic resources of the entire world. There is a colonization of life worlds that is actually happening. And worst of all, we are facing a situation of gaping de-democratization and institutional governance deficits where the digital economy has absolutely no rules at all. Next slide. So against this backdrop, now, you know, that picture is quite dark and dismal. But I would like to talk a little bit more about a way forward and looking at what is the deal for digital justice that feminists want. There's also a resource that I have linked here, which is, it's like a manifesto that's prepared by a group of global feminists who came together a couple of years ago. And maybe you can check that out later. Now, can we go to the next slide? Because I would like to share some high points of this process that we thought through a couple of years ago. So firstly, in order to decolonize the digital economy, nothing can be done unless we hold transnational digital corporations accountable for women's human rights violations. So when we think of women's human rights, I'm not just referring to civic political rights and what happens on social media and things like this, but I'm also talking about human rights in an integrated and indivisible way, looking at economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development, because all these rights have to be thought about together. It's extremely clear that developing countries cannot pursue their autonomous pathways to development unless they have the space now to institute rules on the terms on which digital platform companies offering various services are entering their local market, the terms on which foreign direct investment from digital capital enters their local domestic sectors. On these supposedly flat platform marketplaces, competition law can be applied in order to ensure that algorithmic opacity and algorithmic gaming does not go against the MSMEs of the global south. The micro, small, medium enterprises are not being left out or squeezed. And finally, each of the countries has their right to determine how to localize data resources, when to restrict cross-border data flows to protect human rights and strategic economic interests, in order to ensure that just like natural resources, data resources are able to be used to grow their domestic digital economy. So this may seem like common sense and fairly obvious, but what is really chilling is that right now at the World Trade Organization, there are joint statement initiatives, plurilateral trade agreements that are of questionable legality and actually quite illegal in fact, that are being negotiated by blocks of countries on different topics like e-commerce, the domestic regulation of services, and the investment facilitation, where essentially the powerful will go on making rules and impose them on the powerless. And in effect, what this will mean is that no country in the South will be able to regulate platform capital, and it will not be able to pursue its growth pathways in the data and AI economy. And we can also discuss this a bit later. And I'm sure Diyana will also be talking about these illegal joint statement initiatives in her presentation and why we need to challenge them. Next slide. Secondly, it's not just enough to have a negative agenda of saying no to trade injustice, right? we also need to pursue at our local levels the search for alternatives that can bring us a fair share in value. And here I would like to point out how capitalist platforms thrive on data extraction and data exploitation, like we all know. But that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's important to explore alternative models, alternative cooperativist ways of exploring platforms that can actually bring a fairer share of value for local economies. So in this diagram that's here on this slide, you can actually see that data extractivism thrives on value expropriation by digital capital. And typically in the world right now, there are three ways of thinking about alternatives. So one is an approach that has been tried by many alternative groups in the European Union. And that's an approach we like to call data minimalism, where the idea is that let us just build platform marketplaces which do not collect any data or use data-based intelligence. Let's just try to use the internet in a pre-big data way. Unfortunately, in a market where dominant intelligence platforms exist, this is not sustainable, right? Because you cannot, if you run a car cooperative that does not collect data and do intelligence-based matching of taxis, you cannot compete with Uber, which thrives on data exploitation, and Uber exists in the market. The other approach that some cooperatives, especially in the South, were pursuing is like data maximalism. And this brings us to the problem that Rosa Luxemburg has talked about, where worker-owned enterprises mimic the logic of capital. And this leads to unsustainability in business practices for obvious reasons that I think I don't need to go into. So that brings us to the third model of data collectivism, where the idea is that the local economy retains the value. And if you collect data for workers, then you use the intelligence in order to make connections and do network linkages, which will bring a greater share of value for them. For example, the Cooperative Federation Seva, which is run by women workers in India, has tried these models in many sectors, including beauty services, agriculture, and so on. And this is not easy to compete with mainstream platforms, but the quest for alternatives remains, and public support and state support in terms of funding or platform data architecture, that becomes extremely important. Now I come to my final slide. So the final point I would like to say is that in the digital paradigm, we need democratic governance frameworks. So right now, there's a business as usual multi-stakeholderism, which prevents any rules from being forged for the people. And you just have a situation where big tech is governing big tech. So this needs to change. We also need rules for data, which bring the non-economic and economic aspects of the data governance question together. So it's not as if the moment privacy and personal data protection is solved, data can flow freely and, business as usual where US and China dominate can continue. And the final point is that even in the global South, when countries are talking about data nationalism, they need to go beyond like narrow imaginaries of trying to mimic the mainstream capitalist model and actually explore alternative models for regenerative economics. So I stop here and I look forward to hearing all your views. You're on mute, Nancy.
Yes. Thank you so much. Often, even though we're all using the internet and platforms, when we hear the words digital and AI, it all seems very abstract. And here we're talking about trade and war, things that people can visualize very easily, but looking at how the digital aspect of the way so much of the economy is run and how this is actually affecting us very directly in terms of how we live our lives, how we're governed, who profits. So thank you so much for really making these questions concrete for us and providing us with a very interesting set of alternatives that I would be great to continue exploring. And I hope if you are able to provide the link to the manifesto or whatever further resources there are, please do post them in the chat. I'm sure many of our panelists would really love to explore these questions of feminist digital justice further. Now on to our second presenter, who is going to continue on the around the question of alternatives. It's Diyana. Would you like to turn on your camera? And we am very happy to hand the floor over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nancy, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with my fellow esteemed panelists, as well as moderator, and with all of you to be having this conversations around how do we reimagine a different kind of trade system, as well as regime that is both feminist, that is just, that takes into people, planet, as well as peace into account. And I'm actually gonna start off by sort of like premising that because the current trade rules is largely sort of like fundamentally framed around this idea of winners as well as losers, you have a system that inevitably is inseparable from war, from conflict, from violence, and that imagining a different sort of trade system would require us to challenge that fundamental aspect of the trade system in the way it is being framed and designed before we can actually imagine all of the other different aspects that a feminist alternative trade system could potentially look like. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard a lot of governments would often say that trade inevitably will produce some winners and produce some losers, always, without fail. And this premise of winners and losers, well, pardon that use of word, this is basically what a lot of trade negotiators and governments actually use themselves, because you insist that whatever it is, there will always be winners and losers, you have a situation where you will have a substantial level of number of the population who would question why do we need to be losers as a result of these trade rules. And especially as well, when you have a set of rules that inevitably actually creates more losers than it actually does create winners or people who benefit from them. And then you have most reasonable people thinking that, no, I don't want to be a loser as a result of the set of rules that I'm being subjected towards. And so when you have, basically a large segment of the population or a majority of the world's population being unwilling to be subjected to these set of rules because they know it's going to make them losers or they're going to lose out on something, then you have an unwilling population that needs to be subjected to certain trade rules. And when you have an unwilling population, what you inevitably have is government turning into the use of authoritarianism, militarism, police force, as well as violence in order to be able to subject these unwilling populations to these rules that they do not want to be subjected to. And I think we can really see a lot of these examples across many of the continents in the global south, whether it's in the African region, Asia, as well as Latin America, where you inevitably see not just trade policies, but just neoliberal macroeconomic policies as a whole. And when they need to be subjected on an unwilling population, you will see, firstly, the removal of the democratically elected government of the day. And then secondly, that democratic elected government being replaced by a military regime or a military dictatorship. And you can see that in the case of Pinochet in Chile, Suharto in Indonesia, the Shahs in Iran, or even the Marcoses in the Philippines. And so you have this set of rules being subjected to an unwilling population, and this legacy or ongoing legacy or cycle of violence that emerges and is perpetuated by that force or use of force to inflict these populations with neoliberal economic policies. And then you have, of course, at the same time as well, resistance from the population when they're being forced or being subjected to laws and rules that they don't like or that is harmful for them as well as their community. You have, for example, in Mexico, the Zapatista movement, which literally emerged at the very same moment that Mexico itself had entered into the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so this entire premise and notion of there being winner and losers as a result of every trade agreement, combined with there being an unwilling population within all of these trade agreements, or being subjected to all of these trade agreements, is also another reason why you will find a lot of trade agreements today being negotiated in complete as well as total and absolute secrecy. You have basically trade documents being treated like they are basically national securities, because the basic idea is that if most people knew what actually went into these trade agreements in full detail and the implication it would have on their lives, a large number of people in the world will be opposed to it. And most governments don't want that. And so therefore you have this entire cycle where all of these trade agreements gets negotiated, gets carried out in closed doors, away from the public eye, away from any forms of accountability. And then usually you will find information around it after the negotiation has concluded. And obviously, a lot of this process happens without the participation of civil society, social movements, women's rights organizations. In some countries, you don't even have members of parliament, like democratically elected members of parliament, having access to any of this negotiation process. And so that's really part of that whole narrative about like, how do we set these rules on these unwilling population? And one of the ways to do that is really to exclude people from actually knowing about this process as well as informing this process. And so my idea around feminist alternative to the current state system really has to start with the idea that any feminist alternative will have to challenge or dismantle the idea that trade rules have to have winners and losers, and that it's inevitable for trade rules to produce a set of winners as well as a set of losers, and that it shouldn't be that trade rules have to produce winners and losers. And then perhaps, to consider that if trade rules do have to produce winners and losers, no matter what you do, then why do we need these sets of rules in the first place? Because it's going to inevitably produce winners as well as losers. And challenging that idea of winners and losers within the outcome of any kind of trade system and agreement also has to do, or also has to go back to, I think, one of the points that Nancy also mentioned earlier, that how do we position trade agreement not to have the outcome that produces winners and losers, but actually have an outcome that takes human rights, that takes women's rights, gender equality, that takes the climate change or the climate crisis as its outcome, as opposed to simply considering that they will be winners and losers and everything else doesn't really matter apart from that. And so it's really the idea that how do we center human rights within all of trade negotiations, trade policy making, trade making processes for all governments and all countries around the world, as well as within all of the large multilateral systems and spaces such as the World Trade Organization, where a lot of these issues are also being discussed. And some parts of this can also be done through the use of some of the tools out there, such as human rights impact assessments, or social impact assessment, or gender impact assessment, or environmental impact assessment, whatever you might want to call it in different countries, which, while are not tools that might necessarily completely transform our trade system, are useful tools to provide a bit of a buffer or temporary fix to how harmful some of our aspect of our trade systems are. And yet a lot of these impact assessments, and they are actually quite a range of frameworks and tools and resources that has also been put out there by different human rights experts, as well as women's rights organizations and other human rights organizations. And you find that many of these impact assessments are hardly ever, if at all, utilized by any governments in actually designing their trade policies, or meaningfully utilized by any governments in actually designing their trade policies. You will find in a lot of instances where governments do carry out some forms of human rights impact assessment, and even when that assessment comes out themselves, where the government carries it out and it says that this is going to cause harm to people and produce a lot of losers, with harmful consequences, especially on women, on communities, on poor people, you still have a lot of governments insisting that, no, we still need to sign these trade agreements. Yes, it's going to be harmful, but we still need to sign these trade agreements, whatever the neoliberal globalization rationale usually is accompanying that. And so you have even something as simple as impact assessment not really being utilized or meaningfully utilized by a lot of governments to actually ensure that these trade rules or these new set of trade rules that they enter into do not end up or do not turn into harmful effects on communities as well as women. And then I think it also has to do with this idea that because trade is inevitably harmful, and I'm wanting us to all also wonder as well as question among ourselves, do trade always have to be harmful? Like, does it always have to look the way it currently does right now? Or does it have to be carried out the way it currently does right now? And I personally think, and I would like to premise here, that people have always traded, people, communities have always traded across centuries, even before the idea of nation states or borders even came into the picture. People have always traded, and that sort of trading along with migrations and so forth was sort of instrumental in a lot of the different continents around the world in really shaping and diversifying the culture, the food, the practices, and the religion of the people within that continent or within that area, right? And so that the idea that trade needs to look the way it is right now and that it's harmful and it produces winners and losers is also questionable, because there was a period of time where people simply trade and didn't need to rely on international governing rules to help them trade or to allow them to trade and for them to trade in a way that benefits all of the different communities. And so if that was possible back then, or several centuries or decades ago, then perhaps then the idea is, the question that we need to also be asking is, what exactly is wrong with the current set of trade rules? And I think one of the idea and one of the premise that I would like to suggest here is really the fact that this current trade system, in the way it's written at the World Trade Organizations or in all of the other different bilateral and multilateral trade treaties, is really so much more expansive and broad and, over-encompassing all of the aspects of our lives that trade rules, perhaps several centuries and decades ago, didn't actually have. And I think the example that Nandini had around how much of the digital economy is also emerging as a key conversations within the current trade system. And then you also have all of the other conversations around seeds, around the sharing and exchanges of seeds, as I think a lot of the panel in the first speaker also spoke about our public services, like how much access do you have to your water, to your electricity, and so forth. And all of these increasingly becoming actual issues within the larger conversation around trade, when once upon a time, trade was really just about selling of goods. It wasn't even about necessarily, as when it first, like some of the original forms of trade agreements, it wasn't even about selling of services. It was just literally the selling of goods between two different countries and the tariffs that you attach to the sale of those goods, right? And so I think some aspect of reimagining this new feminist alternative to trade would require us to reimagine a trade system that doesn't have all of these new set of rules that didn't have before, and also a new set of rules that perhaps are not suited to be discussed and negotiated within the trade system, and perhaps should be in fact discussed as well as negotiated within other domains that are much more suitable, and where the overarching interest and goal of that space is not profit or is not intended on producing winners or losers, but is really intended on the well-being of the people, the planet, of women, of different communities, of sustainable development, and so forth. And so some aspect of this current trade regime in the way they exist, the investor-state dispute settlement, for example, the patent rules around seeds, around medicines, all effectively would need to be dismantled and completely removed in order for us to imagine like a new set of trade system that is more feminist and that is more just. Mostly because, as Nandini has also mentioned, a lot of these rules obviously undermines the ability of a lot of developing countries, as well as least developing countries, to actually regulate and create necessary domestic laws and policies or infant industries and so forth, which a lot of developed countries had done in the past, but are now effectively refusing developing countries from doing the same thing. And so some ideas around, and while this might not be the best idea, the ALBA sort of like trade agreement between Venezuela and Cuba, which is the first thing that comes to mind, though is not perfect, is an interesting idea of how government can consider other models of trade agreements that isn't just about expanding your current market access. Because what we do have right now is basically governments being forced to open their market to large multinational corporations to sell things within their market, which they are perfectly capable of producing themselves. And I think that's ultimately is the problem with a lot of this current trade regime. And I think this idea that we could consider a trade system that just meets the needs that you have in a country, because we live in a climate change era and you can't necessarily produce everything you need within your own country, and that you should be focused on what are the needs within a different country in a complementary, and I guess you could call barter relationships. Maybe some ideas around alternatives within the trade system that we could also consider further. So that is basically the gist of my presentation. I am looking forward to hearing back from my fellow panelists, as well as from others in the room, about how we can continue to do this reimagining exercise, which is obviously continuously a work in progress, but to do one collectively so that we can really imagine a feminist alternative to the current trade system. Thank you so much. Back to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Diyana. Thank you so very much. This is an excellent presentation, I think, for us to conclude the two webinars on in really talking about rethinking or reimagining trade, and looking at trade as something that is a human activity. I mean, I think most of our countries, we know that markets, trade, it's part of the community, right? But the ownership of those processes, or what parades as supposedly what should be a beneficial, collectively beneficial activity, and could be so important in rebuilding in post-crisis situations, is completely being distorted towards certain interests. Rethinking about, not refusing to take for granted this idea that the winners and losers are an inevitability. I think that's a very feminist approach to say, no, there is no need for us to accept this paradigm of winners and losers within our economies. I mean, it should be unacceptable. And thinking about, I think Nandini also raised these questions of the right to development, as needing to be trade needing to be people centered as well. So I really do hope that our colleagues from the Consortium on Gender, Peace and Security, and those of us who are in the Gender Trade Coalition community can really use this set of presentations. I put the link for the previous one to look at how these intersections, how they're playing out, and how they can really contribute to sustainable peace. So I would like to find out if there are any questions. I am not seeing many in the chat. I have also put, sorry, I forgot during my introduction, Azra Talat Said. I had drawn a blank on the surname, so I've put the names and the link of the names of last week's panel and the link to the webinar. You really, really, really need to go and check those out along with this set. So in the Q&A, here we go. From Eva. That a question that was submitted, a question submitted by an attendee at registration. Please reflect on the short-term and long-term impacts of the Ukraine-Russia war on trade and economy, coins, food, and freedom. from Claire, to what extent is indebtedness of the countries in the global south a particular problem for countries emerging from war and the reason why they have to accept unfair trade deals? A very good question, because the question of debt was also mentioned last week in the case studies from Azra's case studies from Pakistan and Afghanistan. She continues, if debt is a problem, what can be done? And I don't know if you have questions for each other. While we were busy unpacking, I did have one thought, which was, can we really call it trade? Because it seems like it's rather a bigger beast than what we would normally think of as trade. So I'll just throw that one in. I'm not sure who would like to start and which questions you would like to pick.
I can take the first question, or part of it I can take. And I also have a question for Diyana after that.
Great.
So looking at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I really was intrigued by the last part of the question on what does it mean for freedom, also because of my location in the digital rights advocacy space. So we have seen a lot of mainstream media publicity about how big tech companies have become the defenders of freedom in the Ukrainian invasion, right? Like all the, the exiting from Russia, not like giving digital services in Russian territory, trying to make things hard, using or enforcing private sanctions, like in the case of Apple Pay and Google Pay not working. And this is entire rhetoric. What's really interesting is that when big tech companies, like all the time, they have only followed a US agenda, and here too we see that's what is happening. So we all remember about 25 years ago when the global war on terror was initiated by the US. Operation Infinite Justice was renamed as Operation Infinite Freedom or something along those lines. And we remember that Hillary Clinton had really pushed for the idea of internet freedom and internet openness, right, as like a particular US liberal value for the whole world. But who has the internet openness benefited? And internet freedoms actually have just been that a particular US model and US hegemony over the world is enforced. And it seems most ironic now, considering that just one day ago, one of the billionaires of this planet has just privatized the world's biggest public square, right, which is Twitter. You must all have seen the deal between Elon Musk and Twitter. So what is it that we are talking about when we think that, big tech are these neutral defenders of freedom? They are these radical stateless places. I feel we should reflect about this very seriously after the entire media publicity on this. Now I come to my question for Diyana. Diyana, you said something extremely important, also like acknowledged by one of the participants as well on the chat, that we have to stop thinking about these winners and losers paradigm, right? And Nancy also said that. Now, one of the things that we see in trade deals, and especially in the context of digital trade, when there is a race to become AI leader and not to be an AI laggard, whether it's a country like, take a country like India, for instance, or a country like South Africa, the whole idea is that they want to model themselves on a China, right? Or something else. We are not thinking of a new way to be a leader in the global space, or we are not able to think past this scramble for resources logic. Do you have any thoughts on what can be done to decolonize the thinking that policymakers have? Like, what should we be doing? This is my question to you.
That was a very tough one. But I mean, I think firstly, I just want to echo Nancy, because you've raised a really good point, Nancy, at the beginning just now. Like, maybe we should stop calling these trade deals, because they're clearly not just trade anymore. Like, they are about, your food, like what labels can you put on them or not put on them, whether they can be GMO'd or not GMO'd, who has the right to them, whether you can, keep your seed in pots like you have for centuries and then give it to your neighbors in the next seasons or not, or, whether you are able to produce new medicines when you have a factory that can do that, as long as you have access to the patents, and then also just whether your services are being provided by the government or is being provided by the private sector, and then how much are they making you pay when you access those services, and the quality of those services when they make you pay for them, right? And so they're so broad right now that maybe one of the paradigm shifts we should be having as well is perhaps to acknowledge that these are not just trade deals anymore. These are basically rules and regulations around every aspect of our lives. And then maybe once we start calling it that, we can consider that this should not be taking place in the trade agreements or negotiations or domains anymore, because you're not about trade, right? It's sort of like my first point. And then I think that the second point that I think I was also seeing in the chat box, in the Q&A around debt. I think it's really important to note that the debt responses or the debt reliefs for post-war European countries have been very different from the post-conflict or post-war global South developing countries. I think there's no doubt that there was a huge amount of debt relief that was given to Germany, especially after World War II, which for whatever reason has never been offered equally or in similar ways to many other indebted countries in the global South. I think it's the first thing. And then I think the second thing on that is that many of the debt incurred by developing countries in the global South are also colonial debt. They're not necessarily debt in the same way Germany had incurred their debt due to their involvements and participation in World War II. A lot of the developing countries, like say, for example, in Cambodia or Indonesia, where the region that I'm from, the debt that both countries still have until today were actually debt they had to took on in order to be able to secure their independence. So it was an exchange thing with the Dutch as well as with the French, where we will take on the debt from you in exchange for you giving us independence, right? So this idea that the responses towards these two debt in the two regions and the two continents throughout time have always been unfair and unequal, as well as in many cases, as well as unjust. And then I think that's probably the first thing that we need to address, why shouldn't a lot of developing countries today be entitled to the same amount of debt reliefs that a lot of the developed European countries had post-war, right? And then once that idea and that question, I think, around debt and what a lot of developing countries are being forced to do in the name of their indebtedness, is challenged and dismantled, then maybe, as you have also rightly pointed out in the question, if you're not being subjected to paying back your debt, then you can consider other forms and other alternatives of macroeconomic policies within your country, whether that would be in the form of trade or whether that would be in other forms, like how do you design your monetary and fiscal policies, right? Which today, as many of us know, is severely constrained for a lot of countries because of the debt on top of the trade, as well as other macroeconomic policy rules. And then I think on Nandini's question, maybe this is also a conversation that, and maybe it goes back to the first point about how this is not about trade anymore. This is about our entire economic system, right? And maybe a lot of the shifts, and perhaps a lot of the shifts do actually need to happen in our broader conversation about how we define development and what that looks like for different people in different countries. And it's true that a lot of developing countries and these developing countries view them in only one particular way. And then you have people in the developed North as well also viewing them in a particular way. Like, sorry, you didn't have internet access or roads in every aspect of your country, then you clearly are not developed, right? Even when communities that are flourishing, have food security, are able to exchange and don't actually need anything else that is perhaps monetary in nature, but that is often not considered as development or even considered as part within the economy, right? And that's really an area for women, because women are often so much in the informal economy that many times we do things that benefits our community and our society, but it doesn't factor at all in any meaningful ways within the economic system. And so I think it's probably maybe in many ways a shift in the entire paradigm of what we define as economy or as valuable or productive, pardon that use of word, of productive activities within the economy, and what other things that women do, especially and within our communities, are also as valuable to our economy, but has never really been, considered or calculated or taken into acknowledgements or even recognized by governments and even sometimes other people within our country and community. And I actually also have a question for Nandini following her questions to me. I think one of the things that has been always fascinating to me about the rise of the big tech is how it's requiring us to shift our thinking from the old traditional big corporations. Because obviously, for so many of us in many parts of our world, we know the big bad corporations that literally exist physically in our countries, right? Like the Shell, the Chevron, the ExxonMobil, the Monsanto, like they are very physical. And I think that's part of the reason why movements find them easier to imagine, both a resistance as well as a challenge, because oftentimes they're so real and there in your community, right? And so I was wondering, what do you think about this shift from that old traditional type of corporations to these now big techs who operate in a completely different way than like ExxonMobil or Shell would have in the past? And then do you imagine that as we continue down the line, that these big techs would eventually become more powerful, or maybe to some extent also subsume the powers of all the other traditional multinational corporations? Like what do you imagine in terms of like how do these two different type of big techs, well, the big techs versus the other big corporations versus each other as we go, ahead in the future as well?
I think that's a very important question, because I feel that, you're absolutely right that we no longer live in the era of the industrial corporation, right? And what we are seeing today is the rise of the intelligence corporation, because the whole firm thrives on data capital and data exploitation. So the model is completely different, and we need to understand that. And there is an economy of rent seeking instead of an economy of production, right? So there is like an overall increase in the way speculative capitalism operates, and there's a lot of work on how data capital is much closer to finance capital than to think of it as closer to an asset like land or something like that, right? And that then tells us that the speculative capitalism problem of advanced capitalism, which we have seen from the 1970s of the rise of the knowledge economy, that problem is actually getting worse. Then to answer the second question, I think we already see two type of trends, right? One is like where you see digital companies start out in one space and then they start, entering into other spaces, like Amazon being the classic case, right? That you are a firm that becomes and had a stated ambition 20 years ago to become the infrastructural utility on which the world's e-commerce runs. So every big tech business is about that. You become that infrastructural utility layer, and you are a private owned or a monopolistic public utility, which then gives you absolute power, and you are like the Gilded Age barons that we read about in the United States of the 19th century. So that's what is happening here. And all the studies from 2017 actually show that economy-wide, the rise of these superstar firms are just leading to an exacerbation of monopolistic tendencies and the rise of inter-firm inequality throughout, and inter-country inequality as well, because where are these firms with market capitalization based, like the UNCTAD point tells us. If I may, because it's linked to your question, I thought I could also answer a question in the chat box about, could I do that, Nancy? Because then we can close that part of the discussion. You're on mute, Nancy.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, please do go ahead. There are a few more questions that have come in. So if you take on that one of them, I think it's level hands, right?
Yes.
about there's strong opposition from a number of global southern countries on digital rules and data flows and e-commerce. Some of them argue these rules will broaden the digital divide that already exists between the developed and the developing world by exposing local digital firms to fierce competition. What is a feminist response to this, and where and how do we cross the feminist digital divide? So if you answer that, then I'll go to the last few questions, and we will unfortunately, very sadly, have to wrap up. So please go ahead on that one.
Yeah, and to keep that quick, I think what is wrong with the rules being negotiated is something Nancy and Diyana already said. They are not rules for digital trade. They are rules for how the entire digital economy should be run and how data platform and AI architectures should be governed. So it's the same structural problem with these rules. So the feminist response would be to absolutely challenge them. They will also reinforce the monopoly of the United States digital services corporations if they are enacted, because they will permit absolutely unrestricted cross-border data flows, exactly like in a previous era. We saw how natural resources would, flow to the firms in the metropoles. That's what we will see with data, where all the low-income countries are stuck in the low-value segments of the digital economy. And if we have to have a way out, I think the only option here is to negotiate rules for data and AI outside the trade paradigm, because this is not a trade issue. It's an issue about how a resource that is a new form of social knowledge, or if you would like to use Marxist literature, it's a form of a general intellect. So how do you make rules for this so that, we protect indivisible human rights and we safeguard civic political rights and socioeconomic rights and right to development? And we don't do this European method where once you bracket out personal data protection, the rest of data can be traded away and capital is just allowed to do whatever, right? So I feel we need to challenge that and find a new model outside the EU model of regulating data. And that's one of the things we need to look forward to.
Thank you. Excellent response. Really giving us lots of thinking about how broadly we do need to rethink. Just to get to the last few questions, from Patricia, how can appropriate low emissions technologies, e.g. for transport, communications, cooking, lighting, pumps, be developed and shared throughout the global South without corporate intellectual property and other barriers? Is there a movement promoting this? Another question submitted anonymously: in thinking about feminist alternative trade frameworks that would support the building of sustainable peace, you have emphasized that new arrangements will need to be more locally and democratically controlled. But would you both be willing to talk more about key elements of your own vision of what a feminist international trade regime might look like? And then the final one, I think, is all speakers mentioned the potential for trade if the rules of the game were different, the potential for trade to be of positive force if the rules of the game were different. Does consideration of the carbon emissions of moving goods around the world complicate that picture? Great. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. Please do take the questions that you can, and I will try and give a couple of minutes at the end for concluding remarks, but we're almost wrapping up. So please, I think Diyana, quite a lot of them were trade questions directed at you. So would you like to take on a couple of those or give your thoughts around them?
Sure, I will try, because those are some really interesting questions that I also sometimes wonder myself. But yeah, I think the first point that I do want to acknowledge is that trade is one of the largest contributors of global emissions through the transportation aspect of global trade. And so there is certainly a lot of link, and it's often not acknowledged by a lot of the neoliberal trade proponents that a lot of the current trade system is a big contributor to the emission around the world. And that's the first thing that also does need to be acknowledged. Because I think following that, if we go back to this idea and really challenge this notion where you are liberalizing your domestic market or you're providing market access in your country to goods from outside your countries that you are perfectly capable of producing yourself, you are contributing to emission while, you know, basically procuring goods that you don't necessarily need to. And I think last week's panelists, Azra especially, did really highlight that how a lot of the market access for countries in the global south is really about large multinational corporations from the US, from Europe, selling the exact same things that countries that they're selling to are perfectly capable of producing themselves, or had the capacity to produce it, but was, you know, considerably diminished because of the trade policies through seed policies or patent policies and so forth, right? And so if we go back to the idea that trade is really just about what you need, right? If you're not able to produce it domestically, and there are certain things that some countries aren't able to produce domestically, but even more so you could when you do have the right set of technologies and patents. But let's say hypothetically, there are some things you cannot produce or make domestically. And then the purpose of trade is really just to regulate those things that countries aren't able to produce domestically. Then already that makes, I think, a huge amount of difference in terms of the level of global trade and the kind of emission that it's currently producing globally. When, you know, I'm from Malaysia and we eat a lot of rice, and so many of our rice don't even come from Malaysia, and that makes no sense because we're perfectly capable of producing our own rice, and yet we don't, right? They all come from Vietnam. And so that's not necessary, right? And then I think that follows that point around technology sharing. Unfortunately, even though a lot of trade proponents says this, a lot of the trade rules don't actually ensure technology sharing or technology transfer. They usually will have some nice chapter that says, yeah, share technology, blah, 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 but it doesn't actually mean anything, because oftentimes these policies or these chapters get circumvented by more tighter intellectual property laws around patents, around copyrights. And I think for many of you who might be following the entire conversations around the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization, I think it's such a good example of just how much some of these trade rules undermine, even in the most urgent time and a crisis moment, the actual technology sharing and transfers to developing countries, many of whom actually do have the capacity, but simply just don't have the patents and the technology information and know-how to produce vaccines as well as treatment for COVID around the world, right? And so a lot of these kind of trade rules actually undermines technology sharing, even for technologies around cutting down emissions or for renewables. I think the India and the United States have a fantastic example of how that works, because India has been continuously sued by the US for protecting or basically creating a carve out for its domestic renewable energy or solar panel production industry, which is a very sort of like goal to ensure that you are able to basically produce these kind of things domestically, right? So they've been continually sued by the US government, and they have lost at the World Trade Organization. And then ironically, India then in turn decides to sue the US government, because a lot of the states, not the federal government, but a lot of states government in the US also have their own domestic renewable energy industry that they will protect, because it's all part of our long-term goal to shift everybody into renewable energies, right? And so, it's such a fantastic illustration of how these rules just allow governments to continuously undermine even any local domestic efforts to actually create and transition into more sustainable, green, as well as renewable energies.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for responding to, I think, a lot of those, most of those questions, taking on questions of intellectual property rights, and also, bringing in this question of the importance of domestic production. For Africa, for example, we are so dependent on raw material extraction to this day, and our governments and leaders will talk about beneficiation and added value and so on and so forth, even though it's still for export, rather than really looking at diversification of domestic production, and in a sort of cliche sort of term, consuming what we produce rather than consuming what is producing for consumption elsewhere. So those are really important fundamentals that we do need to continue to go back to. And we have I think 5 minutes left, if that. So I'm going to ask for the final comments. Yes, there are 5 minutes remaining. So you have a couple of minutes each for some final thoughts around the questions of sustainable peace, trade, and post-war recovery in the sense of rebuilding and reconstruction at the end of conflicts or in conflict affected situations. I'm interpreting things in a very broad way, but and picking up from last week and this week, recommendations, way forward, what should we all go off and do from here? Please give us your thoughts and how there are various struggles and so forth that we can continue to support as we have these two communities from trade and development and trade justice and from gender, peace and security coming together. Thank you. Who would like to conclude? I have Diyana in the screen in front of me. So would you like to, and then we'll finish and Nandini will give her last couple of comments after you.
Sure. I suppose just very, very quickly to just say that I think I really appreciated being able to have these conversations with all of you, as well as my fellow panelists, about this intersection of trade, gender, as well as like post-war conflict, as well as the intersection of that with actual occurrence of war, violence, as well as conflict, because I don't think it's necessarily an area that perhaps both sides of the movement have necessarily looked into very closely. So I think it's really been a wonderful experience to have this conversation with all of you this evening. And then I think I will just sort of close by saying that there's such a growing movement, I think, for both feminist peace and justice and security, as well as feminist trade, feminist economic policies. And I think that need for changing and transforming our current economic system has never been more urgent than it is right now, both because of this impending, already arriving climate crisis that we are facing, but also just what COVID-19 and the crisis that it brought and will potentially leave the world in for the next couple of years is going to leave us with. And so there is truly an urgent need to transform the system that we live in, the political, the social, but especially the economic system, because I come from the position that the economic system is perhaps one of the most powerful systems that rule our life, because it basically dictates much of our political system as well as much of our social system as well. And so that transformation really needs to happen. And then it really needs to happen through a global North as well as global South allyship as well as solidarity, because the reality is a lot of those powers remains in the global North. And then a lot of the oppressions and the consequences of the system occurs in the global South. And so we do need more allies, more movements in the global North to be demanding accountability from their governments for all these terrible rules that they're subjecting global South countries to, but also, of course, for many of us in the global South, we have continued to and will continue to resist many of these rules coming from also terrible governments in our continent and our side of the world, often working complicit or, in collaborations with many other elites or wealthy, rich countries in the global North. And so I think this is a wonderful space to continue that conversations around solidarity within the two economic South as well as North, and then, potential for more activism everywhere.
Thank you, Diyana. Thank you. And Nandini?
Yeah, just a quick line. My learning from the last webinar and the discussions at this one is that I think in all the feminisms we must practice feminisms that bring the politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution together, and only then will be able to achieve the project of decolonizing trade and development, which is essential for sustainable peace and the fight against structural violence to succeed. And I also completely agree with and echo Diyana's call that we have to invest in feminist solidarity building of all different types of translocal solidarities, and with all feminists involved in different movements.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I couldn't have concluded better myself. We are ending the webinar. Thank you, Nandini. Thank you, Diyana. You were so interesting to listen to. Thank you, Carol, and team Melissa, I think, from Gender Security and Human Rights Consortium, Anita and Aisha from Gender Trade Coalition and Regions Refocus. I saw my fantastic chair from last week, Michelle, who was also putting some comments in the chat. So from the panel last week, Michelle, Leruhan, Fatima, Azra, again, to give a vote for thanks for setting us up for this webinar in such an excellent and rich way. Myself, this is Nancy, really happy to have been here. Please, everybody, as you leave, do not forget to fill in the feedback form. It really does help building and give ideas on the way forward. And there are links to where you can get more information. Congratulations to the organizers of this webinar series. It really has been excellent. And thanks to all the participants as well for making the time and being here. Please do share YouTube links after this, so that we can share all these great learnings from the 2 webinars with our comrades in other places and spaces, in the feminist and otherwise, where they think feminists aren't thinking about things. We need to show them that actually we're way ahead of the curve on many of these topics. So please, yes, do share and tweet. I think that's the end now. So I am signing out. Yes. There's lots of thank yous coming in. Great.